I called the person that you listed as your previous landlord, and strangely, he didn't seem to know you.
I really believe that the best fiction is an exercise in empathy, in imagining what it's like to be someone else.
No one story is going to tell the whole Asian American experience. If I'm offered a seat at the table, I want to make other seats at the table. I guess I want to make more chairs.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Michelle Yehi, the Washington Post Tokyo Bureau Chief covering Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Today, we continue our Race in America series with best-selling author Celeste Ng. Celeste, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
And you as well. A reminder to our audience, we want you to join in on our conversation. So please tweet your questions and comments to the handle Post Live. Welcome, Celeste. Let's get started. I'm so excited to dig in. So let's start with Our Missing Hearts, your new book. I have it right here. Tell us about some of the book's main characters. Bird, his mother, Margaret, who's a Chinese American poet, and his father, who's a linguist who works at a library. Please tell us about their world.
Yeah, Bird is a 12-year-old boy at the beginning of the novel, and he's growing up without his mother. His mother left the family a few years ago, and he and his father are living in a world that's really suffused by fear. There's a lot of distrust. The country has come out of a huge economic and social period of upheaval. And there are new laws in place, particularly one called PACT. And that basically enables the government to take away the children of anyone that they think is acting un-American. And of course, often that's being used to target the group that's currently seen as the enemy, which is Chinese Americans, by extension, Asian Americans, or anybody else who speaks out on their behalf. So when the novel starts, Bird doesn't know much about his mother. His mother has left the family in the wake of these laws. She's a Chinese American poet, and his father is a white man. And Bird has spent most of his life trying to fly under the radar and trying to blend in.
This book addresses so many themes that feel very relevant today and feel very drawn from reality. Like you mentioned, xenophobia, separated families, economic angst, immigrant life. It feels very foreign, but not foreign at all. You've described it as turning up the volume on our own world. What questions about our world were you looking to explore through this book?
Yeah, I really was asking myself a lot of questions about what my place was in the world, how to raise a child in a world that felt like it was increasingly hostile towards him and to many others. And also how to hang on to hope that we could actually change anything. The past 5-6 years in particular, I think I felt like I've become so aware of huge societal problems. And I at least have felt very helpless some of the time, thinking, well, what can one person do in the face of huge systemic problems like racism? It made me wonder as an artist, what am I doing? Am I actually doing anything to help? And part of what I wanted to explore in the book was what one person can do and how you hang on to hope that you can actually still make a difference.
Right, you've talked about how the seeds of the book came around 2016, and then, of course, over the years, many other themes developed, like the anti-Asian violence that was rising in the pandemic. How did witnessing what was happening around the world and trying to process it at the same time shape your storytelling in this book?
Yeah, I had always been thinking about what it was like to be an Asian American because growing up as a Chinese American in places where there weren't very many other Asian Americans, I grew up in Pittsburgh and then in Cleveland. I think I've always been aware of the fact that people will sometimes look at me and see me as an outsider, even though I feel like I'm at home. And I wanted to look at how hard it was to overcome that gap between how you see yourself and how other people see you. And one of the things that seeing so much anti-Asian violence happening in the wake of the pandemic really brought home to me that this was something that I felt like I had to look at straight in the face. It was something that I wanted to acknowledge and witness and not shy away from. I wanted other people to recognize this is a real thing that happens.
That reminds me of a scene in your book, and I don't want to, I'm so careful not to spoil anything, but there's a scene that was very jarring to me because it came out kind of suddenly for me, yet it really captured the violence that all of us had been witnessing against our Asian American communities, particularly the elderly. And the way you described it, the way you really framed it, you didn't hold back. Did that willingness to really shine the light on what was happening, is that kind of how that affected your decisions on sort of how to tell those sorts of moments?
It did. I wasn't sure how much I wanted to talk about anti-Asian violence in the book. It isn't something that I want to think about. It's something that, that honestly, it scares me. But it did feel like when there were so many stories in the news, we were seeing this right out in the open. We were seeing attacks on elderly people in many cities across the country. We were seeing it happening in broad daylight. And scariest to me was we were seeing people who would just watch and let these things happen. There was one particular incident that happened in New York, in Midtown, where there was an Asian person who was stomped on in the middle of the day. And that was terrifying to see. It was all caught on security camera. But I think the scariest thing was that nobody did anything except for the doorman at the building that they were in front of. And he came out and he closed the door. And that to me was really chilling. That, like you said, I think really gave me the push to say, okay, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to show this because it feels like it's something that needs to be acknowledged.
The thing is, I actually thought about that exact case when I read the book, and I could relate to how you might have felt at the time witnessing it, and how it might have affected the portrayal. And in your book, the themes of othering and being a perpetual foreigner run so deep. This question of loyalties, just because you look different, even if you're born in the country, being told not to be the nail that sticks out. And you've talked about how, your job as a fiction writer is to make readers think about these questions rather than, maybe perhaps having answers. So how do you hope this book helps readers wrestle with those questions about what does it mean to be American and what does it mean to be foreign?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't want to pretend that I have the answers, and I don't want to pretend that any answers I have speak for anyone else. But those are the questions I think we need to be thinking about, which is what does it really mean to be American? In the novel, anything that's seen as even vaguely criticizing America is seen as unpatriotic. There's this sense of nationalism that, you're either with us or against us. And that's one of the questions I hope readers will take away, which is when does it make sense to look at the country that you live in and try and make it better, acknowledging its faults. One of the things that I think we've seen a lot in the news right now is maybe an unwillingness to look at the places where we haven't done as well as we could have, where we haven't lived up to the principles that I think we're supposed to be living up to as a country. And I think acknowledging those mistakes, acknowledging the things that have happened in our history that would like to we'd like to correct, we'd like to learn from. I think we have to look at those things carefully, or else we're just going to repeat the same mistakes from the past again.
Yeah, I thought a lot about, for example, House Committee on Un-American Activities and the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, incarceration. I thought about all those things as I was reading your book, and I think it really resonated because, as we discussed earlier, it felt a little foreign, but not quite foreign enough. And one of those themes was separation of children from their families. How did you come to focus on that?
Well, this is something I'd actually been thinking about since I got the idea for the novel. A lot of it is personal. I'm a parent myself, and when I think about what is the scariest thing that could happen to me, I like to think that I will live by my principles and I'll stand up for what I believe in. But the one place that calculation gets really complicated is if it feels like it's going to put your family or people that you love in danger. And so I had the idea that one thing that might be used to keep people in line politically would be threats to their children. And then, of course, I started to research, and I learned about a lot of the times that this has already happened in American history and elsewhere. Got the separation of enslaved families from the very beginning, got the boarding schools for Native American children. And then, of course, while I was already in the middle of writing the book, the separation of migrant families at the US-Mexico border became a big topic in the news. And it again was a reminder that this is not something new. This is not something made up, in some kind of dream scenario. It's something real that happens. And again, I think we have to look at that and acknowledge it, or else we're going to just keep doing it again.
Mm. And speaking of those realities, you also talked about how you were struck by watching democracy unravel in real time in multiple places around the world, particularly in Hong Kong, where your family is from. Tell us how your family background and your observations of that gradual crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong affected your thinking and writing.
Yeah, I was really interested in the situation in Hong Kong because both of my parents are from there. My mom was born and raised in Hong Kong. My dad was born in mainland China, but moved to Hong Kong as an adolescent. So that's the place that I feel sort of a family connection to. And I, had family who grew up there. And they, having grown up, since they had grown up there, they, I think, are used to a certain degree of freedom of speech. Hong Kong used to be a British colony for those who aren't up on Hong Kong history. And as such, the people who lived there had a certain amount of democratic rights. And I remember in the lead up to 1997, when Hong Kong was going to be handed back over to China, there was a lot of concern about what the future would be like for the people who were living there. A lot of people moved away. Some of my relatives did. Some of my relatives stayed. And so that's always a situation that I've been watching. And what I've seen in the past few years is a really steady and accelerating erosion of democratic freedoms there. To watch students, for example, protest for democratic rights, and then to watch the Chinese government crack down on those rights, almost to a ludicrous extent, to say, you can't hold up signs that protest the government because that's unpatriotic. And then protesters would start holding up blank signs, and the government say, well, you can't hold up blank paper either. That's also unpatriotic. I think I saw there sort of a foreshadowing of what might happen elsewhere if freedom of speech and democratic rights are continuing to be cracked down on.
In the book, there's such an emphasis on stories, storytelling, folk tales, libraries, the roots of such storytelling. Was that a conscious decision, and why?
It was a conscious decision after a certain point. I always go in sort of following my instincts, and I realized that this mother kept telling her son stories, and that a lot of what he would remember about her, since she left him when he was quite young, were the stories that she told him. And once I realized that was something that my brain was thinking about, I started to interrogate it and say, what's interesting to me about that? And one of the things I realized is that stories, I think, are how we make sense of the world. And they're also the way that we shape our understanding of everything that informs us. So stories that people get told at bedtimes, for example, they are in some ways kind of shaping the way that you look at the world. So Bird hears a lot of fairy tales from his mother, and he starts to think of himself as a character who's on sort of a fairy tale quest to go and find her. But there's also the stories that we tell about our own history, about people within our family. And Bird starts to understand that the story he's been given about his mother is maybe not the full story. And that's part of what he's trying to investigate too. So I wanted to look at the ways that stories and retellings get shaped by who's telling them, and our understanding of them gets shaped based on where we are in our lives.
As a journalist and as a former library reference desk worker myself, I really appreciated the emphasis on storytelling and our recollections of stories and wanting to repeat them and preserve them. And speaking of narration and whose point of view you wrote it from, you chose to write it through the eyes of a 12-year-old child. What led to that decision?
I always had the idea that Bird was the person that we should follow through this story because again, he's right at the edge of adulthood. He's still a child, he's only 12, and yet he's starting to kind of tiptoe towards an adult understanding of what's happening in the world. I think for many of us around that age of adolescence is when we start to get a sense, oh, there's a larger world outside of just my family or just my neighborhood. We start to get a sense of, oh, there's lots of history that maybe I need to learn about. There's lots of people out there in the world that I haven't thought about before. It's the time where for many people, I think we start to understand sort of the context of our whole existence. And it's also the time when we start to get a sense of our parents as people. We start to recognize, oh, they had a life outside of me before I was born, and maybe they still even have a life outside of me now. And that's part of what Bird is trying to understand. He's trying to understand who his mother is and why she's done the things she does outside of being his mother.
I'm curious about your personal journey as well, coming to those realizations. You talked about your family's roots in Hong Kong, and growing up in America and the feelings of otherness and being a perpetual foreigner. What was that journey like for you, finding your voice as an Asian American and also learning your parents' journeys and coming to appreciate that, or maybe kind of see them in a new light as you grew up?
Yeah. I think at the beginning, I always knew that I was, other. I was different from other kids. And for me, that was a source of pride in a lot of ways. I think my parents they really made a point of saying to me, you are Chinese and American, and here are things about your Chinese heritage that we think you should know. Here are reasons that, we think that it's great that you have this heritage. And I appreciate that they did that because it would have been very easy for them to say, oh, just don't worry about that. Just try and be as American as you can be and blend in. Assimilate was the term that was used a lot in my childhood. And looking back, I recognize how much it meant to me that my parents were like, you are more than one thing. You are of Chinese descent. We are from Hong Kong. We also live here. And to say that those things could coexist with each other. That's something that I've started to recognize more and more now that I'm a parent and I'm raising a multiracial child, and I'm trying to figure out how to make him feel that all the parts of his heritage are something that are available to him. How to teach him to say, you can be more than one thing, not even both things, but multiple identities, and to make him feel that that's something that he can be proud of rather than something that he has to just choose one identity for.
Mm. And that mixed identity is also something that Bird also has to grapple with, and in this world that he lives in. I appreciated your exploration of Chinese characters, as well as Chinese letters, I mean, as well as American language and words, as a part of the linguistic exploration in your book. Was there a reason you chose Cantonese over Mandarin?
There is. It's because my family are Cantonese speakers. Coming from Hong Kong, my parents spoke Cantonese and a couple other dialects. But um, for those who don't know, because I realize many people don't know, there are multiple, they're called dialects, but I think they're honestly almost more like separate languages. And this is a debate that linguists get into. But Cantonese is very different from Mandarin, which is the language that's spoken in mainland China and is the language that is mostly spoken here in Chinese immersion programs and things like that. Cantonese has its whole own history. It's related, but it's very different. And there's a political aspect to that as well. Cantonese is spoken in just the area down south near Hong Kong. And it's a language that's, in my opinion, being slightly squeezed out by Mandarin. Since the Chinese government has taken control over Hong Kong, they are making everyone learn Mandarin, and there's less and less Cantonese. And as with anything around language, this is a political decision. And to me, it feels really important to not just say Chinese, but to say Cantonese, because that's where my family's from. I don't want this language to be erased, but also just to remind people that there's nuance in something that we think is a huge monolith like Chinese language. There's actually many, many, many varieties, and Cantonese is just one.
Yeah, I was really curious about that as I was reading. I want to ask you about your craft and your career. You know, you've talked about how if you're offered a seat at the table, you want to make seats, other seats at the table, and make more chairs for other people. Can you tell us why it's so important for you to open doors for aspiring writers, and tell us about those who helped you get seats at the table and what those people meant to you?
Yeah, I guess that's always how my parents raised me. They always raised me and my sister to just say, you know, if you have something, see if there's somebody else who you need to share with. If you have a free second, look around and see who else you should help. Part of that, I think, came maybe from them being immigrants themselves. They came over in the late 60s. They were young. They'd just gotten married. They didn't have any family here. And I think they recognized the value of community. And some of the friends that they made in those early years are still, were friends of my parents for years. My mother's still in touch with them. And I grew up calling them my aunts and uncles. And I think that experience maybe shaped how they looked at the world. It was really, you don't get anywhere on your own. And that means that if you get somewhere, you need to pay it forward. And so that's always how I've tried to look at things. So as a writer, one of the things that I can do is help promote other writers. I am not the only person who writes about Chinese American experience, Asian American experience, nor should I be. And so I think making space for more voices is something that feels really important to me. It just gives us a fuller picture. It makes our whole culture richer.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talked about how it was a really taught value for you. I don't think it comes naturally to a lot of people, and I think that's important to emphasize that, you know, it is something that it's a value that you had grown up with and something that you wanted to imbue in your career. Were there people who were really formative to your experience as an aspiring writer?
There were. I think back even to my elementary school teachers who saw me scribbling little stories on scrap pieces of paper and encouraged me and were like, this is great, you should keep going, right? Who treated it like something that had value. Then I think to my college teachers, for example, one of whom was the first one to suggest that maybe writing was something that I could try doing as a living. I had always thought it was something that I had to keep on the side, that I needed what I called a real job, and then I could write on the side. And one of my teachers said to me, you always say that's on the side. What if you put writing in the front and just see what happens? And it had never occurred to me that that was something that I could do. And she helped me look at different programs and figure out where I could apply. Once I got to grad school, I was lucky enough to get into a program. And I had teachers who went above and beyond anything that they really needed to do to just talk to me about what it was like to be a writer. I didn't have writers in my family. And so they talked to me about the writing life and how do you pay your bills while you're also trying to finish your first novel? How do you balance having a family with trying to get your work done? Those are all ways that I think people supported me. And if I can pass them on, I would love to do that.
Yeah, the power of a light touch of encouragement and a little nudge toward risk taking. Um, so I think this book comes at an interesting time because there's a rise in the banning of books in several parts of the United States, while at the same time, more states are requiring the teaching of Asian American history in public schools. And how do you contend with both of those things happening, both of those developments, as an Asian American, as a writer, as an Asian American writer, and especially after having explored these very themes in your book? How are you making sense of those sorts of developments?
Well, I think it's great that more schools are requiring the teaching of Asian American history. I really didn't learn much of it even growing up in a pretty progressive school district. If we learned about Japanese American internment, for example, I think it was one of those little boxes down in the corner of the history book, and we didn't really talk about it very much. So it's something that I think has been a long time coming. I think the counter to that is there's a real fear in certain parts of the country about narratives being told. I'm thinking, for example, about a lot of the pushback against what's called critical race theory, but seems to be just applied to anything that is talking about race at all. That feels really dangerous to me, along with the move to ban books, because what I think it's saying is these stories aren't valuable. These stories shouldn't be told. And maybe these stories even should just be forgotten. And I think what happens again when we forget those kinds of stories is that we lose an opportunity to learn from our mistakes and we end up repeating those same mistakes. So when I see, for example, bills being proposed that suggest replacing the word slavery in history classes with terms like forced migration, I worry again about what it is that those groups are trying to get us to forget.
Right. The impact of words and the access to information. Like you said, the box of maybe a box in the books, in history books about Japanese internment or incarceration. I don't even remember when I learned it. And if I did, I think it might have been a footnote.
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah.
I learned about it earlier than I think most people did because only because of my mom. My mom really made a point of buying books by and about Asians and Asian Americans when I was a kid, and in the early 80s, a lot of those books were memoirs about incarceration. But I think one of the things that learning those stories does is, again, it gives us a better context for ourselves. We get a fuller picture of what our country is, about what has happened in life, and then hopefully that lets us make better decisions about how we're going to act in the future.
Yeah. So in our final minutes, I want to ask you, because you've said that you read a lot of nonfiction in between projects, and I know this one just came out, but you know how sometimes those readings in between projects can help shape ideas along the way. How has that process worked for you in terms of like getting those sorts of inspirations in between projects, and what are you reading now?
Well, in between projects, I try to let myself have a little freedom. I figure that if I'm interested in something, my subconscious is thinking about it. And so I'll just follow my interests where they go. Right now, I recently just finished reading a book by Ed Yong. He does a lot of science writing for The Atlantic. He wrote a book first about, this is where I forget the names of every book I've ever read. He wrote a book first about sort of microbiology and like the small organisms that live inside us. And then his most recent book is about like animal consciousness, which is just something that I think is fascinating. He's a fantastic writer. So that's the most recent piece of nonfiction that I've been reading. You don't know where ideas are going to come from, and you don't know sort of how reading more about the world, and especially things that you don't know, will spark new understandings of the stuff you thought you knew. And that's one of the reasons that I like reading nonfiction, but I like kind of branching out in between projects because it's a space for me to figure out all the stuff that I don't know and then where I want to dig and learn a lot more.
Well, I cannot wait to read whatever your next work will be. I'm a big fan of your previous and current work.
Thank
And
you.
unfortunately, we're out of time. So we will have to leave it there. And thank you so much, Celeste, for speaking with me. We really appreciate this time.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate this whole series of just making this a conversation that's ongoing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com. I'm Michelle Yehili, and thank you for watching.